This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Senna House. My name is Mattia Gallotti. I'm a philosopher by training and currently the coordinator of the Human Mind Project. Now, I guess you know the Human Mind Project is one of the central academic initiatives of the School of Advanced Study. Despite the name, we tend to think about the project as a research program. So we do cluster on a number of different things, from academic publications to events to outreach activities. And today we're adding something new to our agenda. This is the official launch of a new seminar series, and I'm very pleased to have Bryce Huebner here from Georgetown University. Bryce will give a talk on MacroCognition in humans and insects. Now, I guess we do many things as part of the project, but we have a very common interest in the mind. So we're interested in understanding the nature of the mind, how the mind works, and in a way to go back to foundational questions about, again, the nature of the human mind. And we do that in a very sort of interdisciplinary fashion, trying to bridge the gap between the arts and humanities and the natural sciences. Now, without further ado, I'd like to say a few words to introduce Bryce, and then we'll go on with the lecture and the questions and the discussion. Now, Bryce Huebner is Associate Professor of Philosophy at Georgetown University. He has done a number of postdocs in psychology, philosophy, cognitive science, Harvard, Tufts University, before joining the philosophy department at Georgetown. He's done extensive work especially in the philosophy of cognitive science, again, from a highly interdisciplinary perspective. His work was published here in various journals, including Trends in Cognitive Sciences, Philosophical Studies, History and Philosophy of Science, and so on and so forth. Last year, his book came out, MacroCognition. You see we have a few copies sent from Oxford University Press, and lots of flyers, just if you're interested to go online, have a look and buy it. So Bryce will talk for about 45-50 minutes. Then we'll have obviously a general discussion, and then you're very warmly invited to join us for a glass of wine outside, and we will continue our discussions in a rather friendly and informal environment. All right, so without further ado, here's Bryce Huebner. Please join me and welcome Bryce for the first seminar. I'm circulating a mailing list if you want to read your email address and details. Thanks.
Okay, first let me say thank you to Mattia and to the Human Mind Project for having me out, and for putting me in a room with some of my favorite cognitive scientists working on social cognition. I want to come at things from a slightly odd direction in this talk. In that book there, I defend the hypothesis that some groups ought to be seen as cognitive systems. And what I want to do in this talk is to think a little bit about the distribution of groups that function as cognitive systems in our world. And I think the distribution is odd, because I think that some kinds of insects function as cognitive systems, and I think that some groups of humans function as cognitive systems, and there's very little else in the world that does. And my goal in the talk is to try and explain why that's the case. I'm going to try and do that by throwing some examples at you. So this talk is kind of like eating tapas or meze. It's a series of nice little bite-sized tidbits, and hopefully, even if you disagree with me at the end of it, you'll have something to take away from that. Okay, I want to start, though, with 5 theoretical commitments that I have, so you know where I stand moving forward. The first is a commitment that I borrow from William James, but it shows up in a lot of other places. I just like the way that James paints it. He says, imagine that you throw a pile of iron filings on the table, and you put a magnet on the other side. What you'll find is that the pile of iron filings is immediately drawn to the magnet. If you put a piece of paper up in the middle, the iron filings will be stuck dumbly against the piece of paper. They won't do anything to get around it. Contrast that with Romeo. If you put a wall between Romeo and Juliet, Romeo finds a way over the wall. That gives us a deep insight, James claims, about what the nature of mind is. Minds are things that allow the goals and the ends to remain fixed, while the means of achieving those ends or goals vary. That's my first commitment. Anywhere we're going to say that it makes sense to say that something is a mind, we need to be able to make sense of the claim that it can have its ends stay fixed while varying its means. Put slightly differently, being in mental states and carrying out mental processes requires the capacity to represent the world in light of how it's disclosed to you, and the capacity to adjust your behavior in light of new evidence. Second commitment. The second commitment is a commitment about architecture, and a commitment about the architecture of complex systems and why they have the character that they do. Minds, like all other processes that arise out of the process of biological selection, are kludges. Evolution works by kludging. New components are added into a system piecemeal, and they're interfaced with one another, and this progressively generates anchored points of stability within a sea of variation. So when we think about biological systems, which my guess is most minds that we're familiar with are going to be biological systems, they're going to be built by building more complex architecture on top of simpler architecture. The third commitment. This one is slightly more contentious, but I think well established. And the example I want to use comes from recent work that Andy Clark's been doing, but it's all over the place. So when you look at this image, what you find is that the character in the middle of this series looks obviously to be a number. But if you change the context, the character of that representation varies as well. Across all sorts of cognitive and conceptual and mechanical processes that we find in biological organisms like us, as well as like many other animals that we encounter in the world, we find that that process of kludging has yielded an architecture where information flows in two directions. From the bottom up, low-level representations are created in us that are tied to concrete and discrete representations of things in the world. And as information is fed upward through the computational hierarchy, representations become more and more abstract until they reach the level of representations that are articulated linguistically and conceptually. But at the same time, and just as importantly, high-level predictions, which are increasingly abstract categorical predictions supported by language, feed back down into the representational hierarchy, resolving ambiguities in light of expectations about how the world is supposed to show up. So the upshot here is that cognitive processing runs in two directions through kludge systems. Input is concrete and determinate and becomes more abstract as information is propagated upwards. But top-level representations, which rely on explicit and determinate representations, affect perception and action by resolving ambiguities in line with existing hypotheses. That's my third commitment. The last one is what happens when you link this story about kludging to the flow of information in two directions. And this is something that I think is not noticed as often as it ought to be. And that's that the kinds of modularity that are generated by this process of kludging and by the bidirectional flow of information generates what you might call a sort of fuzzy modularity. Well, each of those systems has evolved to carry out a particular task or to solve a particular kind of problem. The interactions between these systems yield fuzzy boundaries between those modules because they're constantly trading information back and forth with one another, integrating representations in ways that generate a unified and integrated structure. Processing, in a lot of cases, is parallel. It's bounded by evolution. But flexibly and dynamically adjusting our trajectory through physical and social space requires trading off the representations that show up in these quasi-modular systems in ways that yield behavior of organisms like us that are only predictable and explicable by appeal to the behavior of the whole organism, because that information flow in both directions generates a unity. As information flows up and down, you end up with a system that behaves in light of not just the incoming information, but the expectations of at multiple layers of computational processing. And the last commitment comes from a bit of a different direction. It's an evolutionary commitment. I think when we start talking about social cognition, we have a tendency to start at the end of the story, to see that cognition is situated group-wise, and then to infer from the fact that we see that there's some form of integration there. I think that instead we should start from the beginning and figure out how individual animals or systems or modules or whatever else exploit the information that's present in other systems in ways that allow them to become integrated with features of their world. And I think that that's the sort of problem that emerges in evolutionary theory that people have noticed for a long time. Explaining the apparent paradox of cooperation is one of the central problems of biology, because almost all of the major evolutionary transitions from replicating molecules to complex animal societies have relied upon them in solving this problem. Now, what I want to suggest, and this is moving forward into the discussion of cases, is that there's a parallel to the problem that shows up in evolutionary theory when you think about how animals interact, how they exploit one another, how they rely on one another, and how they integrate with one another, when we think about the social cognitive case. And just as it's incredibly difficult to solve problems of coordination and cooperation in animal groups, I think it's incredibly difficult to solve the problems of integration that yield distributed cognitive systems that make groups behave as unified cognitive processing systems. So let's start from the beginning. The beginning is the case of bacteria. Well, for a long time, people assumed that bacteria were incredibly simple. Over the last couple of decades, it's become increasingly clear that bacteria are complex biological machines that have the capacity to flexibly adapt to their environments in ways that allow them to optimize successful feeding and fleeing behavior. They have miniature ATP-driven motors that operate roughly like boat engines with propellers. They're flagella in the case of bacteria. But when they move across ocean sediments, when they move across oil slicks, or when they move across the bodies of larger organs, they sprout thousands of appendages that allow them to crawl spider-like across surfaces. Then when they return to liquid environments, these legs fall off and the boat propellers re-engage. They also, as it turns out, are capable of engaging in really complex, though highly mechanical and pretty weird, kinds of social behavior. So the famous example is Vibrio fischeri, which is a bacteria that has the capacity for bioluminescence. What happens is when a single Vibrio fischeri is sitting around by itself or in a small group of others, they don't turn on their bioluminescent properties. But they have the capacity to excrete constantly a molecule called an autoinducer. And when the prevalence of that is high enough, they all in unison flip on. This is a bobtailed squid. Many Vibrio fischeri live in a light organ in this squid that sits right under the body. What happens is each morning that squid vomits out a huge amount of those bacteria and the lights go off and it buries itself in the sand. But over the course of the day, bacteria, as they do, reproduce, release their autoinducers, and as they flip on at night, the squid starts to swim out and uses the light from its light organ to cancel out its shadow, allowing it to hunt in stealth mode. What you end up with here is a set of mechanical processes in bacteria that allow them to bring their behavior into alignment. I don't know that it makes sense to call bacteria minded, and I don't know whether it makes sense to call groups of bacteria minded, but I think those two hypotheses stand and fall together. What I want to dig out from this case, however, is that the basic process of bringing one another's behavior into mutual alignment by signaling things out in your environment is incredibly old evolutionarily. It allows these bacteria to do something that they couldn't do otherwise, to survive in ways that allow them to exploit the light organ of this squid. But I think that there are cases where this kind of process, or a process that's very similar to it, yields genuinely cognitive group phenomena. And this is our second case. It's the case of Arnie ants that dynamically adjust the behavior of the bridges that they create in response to a cost-benefit trade-off that occurs at the level of the colony in ways that none of the individuals are actually aware of. When you look experimentally at a bridge of Arnie ants, what you find is that bridge structure tracks traffic intensity, so how many others are crawling over the top, as well as path deviation, the amount of distance that it's gone away from the concrete path that it's on. And in so doing, it follows a cost-benefit trade-off where increased foraging trail efficiency is balanced against the cost of removing workers from the foraging pool. Arnie ants dynamically adjust the location and the size of their bridges at the local level to meet a cost-benefit trade-off at the colony level. And this is probably, given the models that have been created to explain this, because individuals modify their likelihood of joining or leaving a structure based on interaction rates with other ants that are moving above them or they're acting with them. What you see here, and I think this is important, is a bidirectional flow of information between information that's salient to the individual ants and information that's salient to the foraging colony. They forage as a group. Food is collected and distributed as a group. And one of the things that's incredibly interesting about Arnie ants is that they are highly, highly related. Each of them is related to each other at about the same level as a brother and a sister, or a mother and a child. That allows, through principles of kin selection, a process that looks a whole like group selection to emerge, for characters that are relevant to a colony to have an effect downstream on the information that's going to be processed by individuals. What that yields is a capacity for this system to evolve over a long period of time so that information can be passed up through the computational hierarchy and down from the expectations and assumptions of the group that's building the bridge and that's foraging together. Now, what's interesting is that not all kinds of ants have this capacity. Even closely related ants don't end up with this capacity. It's ones that have passed through a particular evolutionary trajectory where building bridges was an efficient solution to an evolutionary problem. What we see here is an evolved pressure that gives a reason for a group cognitive process to emerge. Something similar happens in another class of eusocial insects. In this case, I think maybe even clearer. This is building on work that's been carried out over the last couple of decades by Thomas Seeley. And one of the things that's really interesting about individual bees is that they're actually pretty smart on their own. They can navigate sophisticated mazes, tracking patterns, tracking signals that provide them with evidence about where to go. They encode information about the environments that they pass through. And importantly, and familiarly, they have the capacity to signal to other members of their colony this information by using a one-to-one mapping of the distance and direction that they've flown in, encoded in a structure known as the waggle dance. They share information by using this process, and that allows them to do a number of colony-level behaviors that none of them could carry out on their own. For example, in foraging allocation, initially, when honeybees begin to forage in an area, they'll send out an initial run of scouts in multiple directions. And what happens is each of those scouts comes back and dances on the floor where they're going to recruit other bees. But because of the quality of the sites that each of them individually runs into, some of them dance faster and for longer and with more vivacity than others. The ones that dance more vivaciously and that dance for a longer period end up recruiting more bees to go to their site than do the ones that dance slowly and uninterestingly. And eventually, this functions as a winner-take-all mechanism, where over the course of a very short period of time, only the most optimal foraging site in the near vicinity is exploited by these bees. They won't go for a second best. Routinely, you can show that they land on the best sites. And they rely on a similar process in finding nest sites. Honeybees have evolved to prefer particular kinds of locations for setting up a nest. And after a hive has become too large, it splits in half, and half of them will swarm and hang out on a tree while they send out foragers once again to look for the best nest site. And you can experimentally vary the quality of different aspects that are salient to honeybee hives for building the best, most effective, and safest hives. And what you find is the same process, the same winner-take-all algorithm allows them to narrow down the potential nest sites, again, choosing optimally. What we find here is top-down expectations that have evolved in honeybees as colonies about what the best nest site is. And low-level information is adjusted against those expectations to yield efficient foraging and to yield efficient nest site selection. But importantly, it's not all eusocial insects that have this capacity to adjust individual behavior in light of group level needs and group level interests. High levels of relatedness do not entail group-mindedness. And I think that there's a very nice example of this in the construction of termite mounds, which relies on a much simpler process of alignment and attunement. What happens is individual termites, when they're building a nest, will drop a mud ball along with a pheromone trace, and future termites tend to prefer dropping their mud balls next to pheromone traces. They use those pheromone traces as signals about how to adjust their individual behavior, but not in light of a plan about what to build. It's merely in light of their current state. In the right conditions, where airflow regulates the distribution of those pheromone traces, you'll get columns emerging, where two columns are close to one another, and where the distribution of pheromones keeps getting closer and closer to the center, you get arches. And because of the way that wind starts to flow through this, you get caverns emerging in the structure. Not because anyone is guiding the construction of that space, and they all end up looking different. It's because of the current situational context that they're adapting against. I think that's an important insight. We ought not posit collective mentality when collective behavior bubbles up through simple aggregative rules without anything being represented by the group. Now, importantly, it's hard to see where things are being represented by a group and where they're being represented only by an individual. And one of my favorite examples of this comes from the large-scale swarming behavior that you see in locusts and in some species of grasshoppers. What's super interesting is that locusts move as unities behaviorally. They form complex groups that move and change directions in unison. But when you look at the kinds of mechanisms that adjust that behavior, it turns out it's cannibalism that drives it. And the reason is that they've got an evolved disposition to have as their second choice food their own blood, the saline content of their own bodies. When they're living in an abundant environment where there's lots of food, they don't have that interest. But as the environment becomes less prevalent with food, they immediately change colors, become sleeker and larger, and they start chasing one another. And as they chase one another, the ones in the front are running for their lives from the ones in the back. And the ones in the back are running for their lives to get the food in the front. And that yields unity. It yields a pattern of aligned behavior. Not because they're interacting with one another in a positive way, but because their behavior is keyed in and tied to each other in a way that depends on self-interest and self-motivation. That runs deep in biology. I think it's important to remember that most biological systems are self-interested and self-motivated. And that's true even when they're not driven by cannibalistic urges. So as we look at things like shoaling fish or at herds of animals, what we see is animals that are capable of adjusting their own behavior in light of their own interest in not being eaten in light of their own interest in safety, in light of their own concern for their future well-being. Being part of a group yields a high selective advantage. Thinking as a group doesn't always. It can, sometimes it does. But in most cases, thinking as an individual who's acting on the basis of motivations that are your own, that are driven to further your own biological interests, hooked up to the behavior of a group, ends up yielding patterns of behavior that look unified, but are unified in their individuality, not unified as collective phenomena. I think that's an important lesson to remember now when we turn to humans. And what I want to do in the second part of the talk is talk about ways that groups of humans can function in ways that look unified and that some people have taken to be evidence of collective cognition, but that we ought not. These are two of my favorite cases of this occurring. The first is an example of an attempt to build a complex computer out of people that would compute logarithmic tables after the French Revolution. Remember, after the French Revolution, there was a drive to recalibrate all of the measurements and to think everything metrically. And that messed with all of the navigation tables that people were relying on for sailing. So they needed new logarithmic tables to calculate trajectories. And what de Prony did was organize a system of people who were becoming less intelligent as you went down the computational hierarchy, which were doing simple mathematical problems and passing them up to somebody who could check that and do little more complex mathematical problems, and pass them up to somebody who could do a little bit more complex problems. But what's interesting here is that de Prony specified each and every action that was going to go on. What happened here is that information trickled down through the structure. There was no flow of decision-making from the individuals going up. They were just acting out the tasks that they'd been assigned by their leader. The same thing happened in the isolation of isotopes of uranium-235 at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. What happened is a few highly intelligent and highly sophisticated people designed tasks and apparatuses to hire people from the community to carry out simple tasks to solve their complex problems. But all of the information was organized from the top down. I think it's a mistake to posit collective mentality where the intelligence of a powerful leader is sufficient to explain the seemingly intelligent behavior of a group. Now, it's true that only the group could isolate isotopes of uranium-235. No individual could do that on their own. But all of the cognitive processing that was going on in working out that task and flexibly adjusting it was coming from the top down. The decisions that were made at the local level weren't adaptive decisions. They were mechanical in much the same way that the behavior of bacteria might be mechanical. On the other side, there are plenty of cases where complex things that look like decisions get made by things like stock markets, where multiple decisions are being made in parallel, yielding patterns at the higher level that are readable by an external observer as perhaps decisions that the stock market has made. But what you see here is a pattern of aggregation, where control bubbles up and where nothing at the top level representation is feeding back down into the adaptive processing of the individuals. The individuals are making their own decisions on the basis of locally available information. their behavior is aligned with the behavior of the other traders, but they're not integrated into a unified cognitive system. I think it's a mistake to posit collective mentality where collective computations simply aggregate the computations that are carried out by individuals. Now, I think that something more than that is going on in the insect case, because you've got high-level goals represented, which are adjusting the low-level responses of the individual ants. In this case, there aren't high-level goals that are feeding back in. Each of the traders is doing their best to maximize their self-interest. It's a lot like a human version of locust swarms. They're not aiming to eat one another, but they are aiming to maximize their self-interest, understood, of course, socially. Okay, so now the question is, how far do these problems generalize? And I think there's an important insight to be learned in thinking through how many of the complex groups that we see in our world use information that is distributed across a wide domain. The case that I want to mention here is the case of biomedical biomedical research that's carried out at multiple sites in multiple areas by multiple research groups. In many cases, what you find is that the biomedical research is carried out on the basis of independent decisions that are made by discrete groups who never talk to one another, who never interact with one another, but pass information upward. At the end of this process, papers are often created. And the question becomes, who is the author of that paper, and who's epistemically accountable for the results that are reported? What I think is really interesting about this is that many of these systems display something like an accidental form of fuzzy modularity. And here's why. Consider the case where you're examining the effectiveness of a vaginal microbicide in a small village in sub-Saharan Africa. As a researcher, you're making decisions at a multitude of points about who was compliant enough, about who was consistent enough with your experimental protocol, about who is reporting accurately on what actions that they engaged in. And there aren't determinate decision procedures about how to decide which people to include and which people to exclude. But after you've carried that process out, all you can pass upward is information that's encoded in the statistical information that is relevant to the next level of upward processing. So what happens is all of those decisions get lost because you compress. Now the problem is you hire a statistician to go through all of these different sources of information, clean them up a little bit first to decide exactly how they're going to evaluate them, and run their statistical model, and pass that on to probably a ghostwriter. And what you find in that case is that new decisions are being made, which are compressing the information, but aren't being recorded. This is all flowing upwards. When the paper is written and something goes wrong, and you try and trace that back through this process of aggregating, compressing, feeding forward, what you find is that there's no way to anchor that into the lower level processing. You can make guesses, you can make statistical hunches, but it's unrecoverable. In a case like this, because of the bottom-up information flow, this often leads to the absence of epistemic and normative states at the group level. In a way, this is just Hayek's point about the flow of information through large groups. Decisions at the periphery are compressed on the basis of locally salient information, which can safely be ignored. But as that feeds into the central decision maker, the information becomes irrelevant to the behavior of the system as a whole. It's no longer sensitive to the needs and interests of the people who are writing the paper or who are presenting the data. It might be close, but it's not going to be determinate and it's not going to be accurate. Control in many of these cases isn't bidirectional. And because of that, you end up with distortions being introduced, which are unrecoverable and unretrievable. My guess is that the vast majority of complex human systems end up running afoul of something roughly like this. We're capable of probably automatically and reflexively bringing our behavior and our thinking into alignment with the people that we interact with. But we do so by compressing information and passing it between one another. And in many cases, that yields situations where the only representations that are usable and viable are housed in the brains of individual agents. The problem of cooperation then emerges. The question of how we can get larger groups of humans, or even small groups of humans, to integrate their representations in ways that facilitate unified cognitive processing by groups. And I think it's a non-trivial task. But I think there are ways of thinking about how to do it. Somebody in this room will probably recognize the image, and it will be clear why momentarily. So, one way to start thinking about this problem and how to solve it is to recognize that as individual processing systems, we're surprisal reduction machines, as I noted earlier. We constantly produce value representations of multiple sorts. Each of the networks that are operating in us contributes to the actions that we carry out in a way that's consistent with that principle of fuzzy modularity. In noisy and stressful environments, we might default to some of the simpler habitual systems, but information is, in us, flowing both upward from simpler to more complex systems, and downward from more complex systems to simpler associative learning systems. And this is the state that we're constantly in, and it's why we function as unities. Together, these representations that are computed by us and by many other animals yield semi-determinate behavioral guiding maps of the world, and they help us to get around, both socially and individually, without representing anything in terms of linguistic representations, or without representing anything in terms of conceptual representations. We attune to the normatively salient and biologically salient factors in our world, to the things we commonly encounter, and to the engagements that we have with other people. But we also have another capacity. We have the capacity to make these representations publicly usable. But this requires taking them and translating them, or compressing them, into something that looks a lot like linguistic structure, and that looks a lot like ordinary language. Here's the second image that at least one person, and maybe two, will be well aware of, maybe more. We have two distinct kinds of systems, and in interpersonal contexts, to borrow from Galati and Frith, the social environment adjusts the potential for social cognition by providing a broader understanding of the options that are available for action, and that opens novel solutions for acting as individuals and acting together. We think differently in social situations, and what we focus on, implicitly, reflexively, and automatically, is how to get our behavior to line up with the behavior of those were around us. But because of the interactions, this is the novel part, I think, between two systems that have different kinds of reinforcement learning histories, that have different patterns of reinforcement and different trajectories as they pass through social worlds, we can use representations that are encoded linguistically to pass information between one another in ways that align our behavior and our cognition, using mechanisms that explicitly represent thought and talk. We can broadcast information in ways that allow us to revise our understanding of the world. And that process of talking to one another and publicly broadcasting representations yields an additional layer on top of that bottom-up, top-down processing hierarchy that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. What it does is allows for a new set of expectations that are publicly represented and which can then feed back into two distinct processing systems, generating a networked representation in some cases that allow two systems to function as a unity because of the way that that top level links them together like a computational network. I think that this insight is incredibly powerful. It's an insight that was first developed by Dan Wegner in the 1980s and early 1990s in his suggestion that some kinds of memory networks function in roughly the same way that interface computers function as a network. What you find is that memories in an individual are represented and stored in networks with something like topical encoding. Retrieval of these uses meta-representations that designate storage locations. And individual memory, in many cases, requires topical encoding, meta-representations, and a process of counterfactual elaboration to flesh out the details of what's being remembered. But memories and meta-memories, this is Wegner's important insight, can be stored in different brains. I can remember that my partner remembers a particular class of phenomena. And because of that, I can start to develop patterns of transaction which don't require re-representing in either of us information that's represented publicly. I can use my partner as part of a transactive memory system. Couples can remember who knows what rather than remembering everything, yielding a cognitive system that's instantiated in a spatially distributed network. So take an intuitive case. The old couple who have spent many years together and rely heavily on one another in remembering and planning their ongoing behavior. Wegner ran an experiment grounded on the assumption that they remember together and showed that couples who worked together remembered more information than non-couples. But far more interestingly, if you told couples what they were supposed to remember, if you said, you focus on this information, you focus on that information, they performed worse than any other group. And the reason is that's introducing an additional cognitive pressure into the distributed cognitive system, which forces them to re-represent information in ways that are distinct from the ways that they represent it automatically and mechanically and reflexively. The other thing to remember in thinking about this is that partners who lose their partners, friends who lose their friends, often have the feeling of knowing when they have a set of representational posits, a set of meta-representations that correspond to information that was stored by their partner, by their friend. This roughly functions like a 404 error, right? The information is not found, but you still have the meta-memory that tells you that you know the information. You just know it as part of a transactive system, not because of information that you've stored on your own. This doesn't happen always, and it doesn't happen in every case where a couple is together for a long period of time. It requires work and collaboration to generate shared structures of encoding, shared structures of isolating information, which can allow for the top-level representations that are explicitly represented and publicly represented to serve as part of the computation that drives group and individual level behavior. This, I think, is a case where it makes sense to think of a group as a cognitive system. Not for every task, not at every time, but to the extent that they're interfaced informationally and integrated and processing information as a couple, it makes sense to treat them as a cognitive system. I think that it's not just memory, and this is where things start to get more interesting and more important. We've evolved to be socially integrated at the level of our basic mechanical and reactive responses. We've evolved to bring ourselves into alignment with one another. But we can also rely on talking with people to generate novel plans and novel structures for action. In cases where we're aligned with others, behaviorally and mentally, we can engage in this process of broadcast to publicly revise our understanding of a situation, to generate a shared understanding which will guide our ongoing behavior as we think about what to do and how to act. In cases where we must routinely rely on one another to plan or remember, we can rely on shared representations that are publicly generated to collectively get beyond our individual reinforcement learning histories, to generate new possibilities for acting together on the basis of information that's being borrowed from all of the computational systems that are well integrated with one another. The broadcast signals end up playing the function of adjusting the behavioral responses of individuals in a group. Not always, and I think that's really important. In situations where groups are hierarchically organized, oftentimes the people at the top of the social hierarchy will think that they're aligned with the people at the bottom of the social hierarchy when they're not. And the people at the bottom of the hierarchy will sometimes conceive of themselves in a situation where they're being exploited or where they're in a competitive situation with somebody who thinks that they're cooperating. Those sorts of differences can block the integration of these top-level representations. It's only at the point where you get to a situation where you're genuinely trying to use the explicit representations that are broadcast by one another to adjust your behavior that you get integrated processing in groups like us. 2 more slides and I'll finish up. There's a worry here, and the worry is that it probably seems like I've made collective representations virtual, and that all of their content is derived from the contentful representations of individuals, and that there's no reason to treat these as having intrinsically any content on their own. Yes, I have done that, as it turns out. And I think there's good reason for that. The good reason for that is individual representations each of the representations that we rely on that have conceptual and linguistic structure have that same character. Top-level expectations and representations in individuals. The ones that are encoded linguistically, the ones that are encoded conceptually, are virtual representations. They're representations that depend for their existence on patterns of social triangulation and social engagement in a linguistic environment. They inherit their content from the social situations in which they're embedded. Linguistic representations, all of them, are compressed representations that allow us to broadcast information and to bring individuals with different reinforcement learning histories into alignment. Conceptual representation is always virtual. Their content is always derived. And on that potentially contentious note,